well, what it's about is there was a scandal that happened back in 2010 is when the scandal broke, late 2010, early 2011, where a Border Patrol agent named Brian Terry was murdered with a gun, and that gun had flown from a gun store into basically the black market while ATF agents were watching the people involved in that case. So, but to really tell the story, what happens is I was an agent in New York, and I worked a lot of gun cases. I had an office, in fact, at the U.S. Attorney's Office. So I was helping drive the ATF cases. I was helping NYPD bring in gun cases that affected federal law. I was working with other agencies. So I had a lot of experience working with the federal laws involving firearms trafficking, use of firearms and crimes of violence. And I'm not saying that to brag. I'm just saying I had a knowledge of what we did. And then I got out to Phoenix. When I promoted, I went out as a group supervisor in 2007. And what I saw there was really mind-blowing. So, I mean, we were stopping cars where people bought guns illegally to traffic to Mexico. And we would stop the cars. We would separate the people in the car, ask them questions like cops do all over the country. Nothing scandalous. We would catch them in lies. We would seize the guns, and we would recommend prosecution. And more often than not, I'd say 90% of the times, the U.S. Attorney's Office would just decline to prosecute the case or say, hey, bring us the information. We'll prosecute it later. We'll indict it later. And I would see that later would never come. So that was one aspect. Another aspect was, we would have, I'll give you an example. There was a case where a gun that had been purchased in Phoenix was used 2 days later, which is rare that you have a gun that's purchased at a gun store and then used so quickly in a crime. So 2 days later, it's used in a shooting in a town called Cananea, Mexico, which is 42 miles south of the Arizona border. And in that shooting, 21 people were killed. 4 of them were police officers. 4 other police officers were kidnapped by the cartel people because they don't just roll in one car. They come in numbers. Right. They're brought out into the desert, tortured, left for dead. Confessions from the people that bought the gun. We get confessions from the folks that trafficked the gun. And the U.S. Attorney's Office made this decision that, well, hey, since the gun is in Mexico, the body of the crime is in Mexico, so we're not going to prosecute that case. And then they went on to say that they weren't going to prosecute any case where the gun made its way to Mexico. The problem is we're charging people with lying on a form. It's called a Form 4473. It's an official document. And we would have that form in our hands. So, I mean, and that was the only U.S. Attorney's Office that took this stance that once the gun made its way to Mexico, the case was not prosecutable. And then the amazing thing is years later, like my group's focus was changed in 2009 because Phoenix became the capital of the United States in home invasions and kidnappings. And I had some experience working those sorts of cases in New York. So a new group was stood up, and they were working with the same prosecutors that we worked with that wouldn't take the cases because the guns were in Mexico. But their strategy pivoted to let the guns go to Mexico, and then they would be able to trace like where those guns were recovered to cartel-related activity, and then somehow delusionally think that they would be able to take down a cartel. Now, what blew my mind was 2 things. First off, DEA had robust networks of people in Mexico. They had informants. They had vetted units. And they also had the narcotics trafficking laws, which were quite powerful. They couldn't bring down the cartels, and that we thought we can use a straw purchasing law, which is pretty weak to do that, is delusional. But the other thing is, it was insulting to me that, first of all, Brian Terry was murdered. And then secondly, we would be told with many, many, many cases that it was unprosecutable because the guns made their way to Mexico. And here, on the flip of a switch, their strategy pivots to letting the guns go to Mexico. I wrote the book because prior to Brian Terry being murdered with the gun that ATF watched ride off into the sunset, there were a lot of opportunities to interdict guns that were falling into the wrong hands and to prosecute criminals. But rather than do that, the U.S. Attorney's Office just punted, and it just gave a pass to hundreds of people who were involved in trafficking firearms to the cartel. So in essence, the U.S. government helped the Mexican drug cartels arm themselves and become what are now almost, in essence, small armies.
Okay, wow, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
So what were the U.S. attorneys, what was the reason that they gave to not prosecute these crimes? Was it political stuff? Was it a belief that they held? What was the rationale?
Well, that's the funny part is I don't know what their actual motivation was. And I've spoken with groups, law enforcement groups. I've spoken at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center about the book. And I'll frequently get asked that exact question. My belief is that they were just lazy. Like it was easy to say, no, hey, let them go, or hey, that doesn't fit our standards, or let them go, we'll indict it later. And then they just never got around to indicting it. It just made it easy to not have cases on the docket because cases require you to do the work, to go to court. But I've had some people say, hey, is it possible they were on the take? I don't think so. Like the cartel was somehow paying off. I very highly doubt that's the case. Could politics have played into it? Sure. But look, they never told me what their rationale was. In fact, the funny thing is when I testified in front of Congress in June of 2011, they actually were denying that they denied some of these cases. I was actually accused of perjury and spent 4 years
Wow.
clearing my name. Luckily, some of those
Unbelievable.
cases were declined in writing. Others were declined in front of witnesses. But I mean, rather than take responsibility for their ineptness, they obviously pointed fingers in different directions. And in the end, like I said, I cleared my name, went back to work. But it was an interesting time. And it was really discouraging to see how the people who you expect to really help protect the public in some instances don't. Because, I mean, each one of those guns, granted, they thought they were going to Mexico, but nothing said they couldn't be pointed at some cop or some kid or some old lady in the United States. I mean, it was just, like I said, what we were doing was routine policing. It was nothing scandalous, nothing unusual. So why they would decline those cases didn't make any sense to me. And then that pivot to letting the guns go to Mexico was unconscionable. Because, again, going back to their strategy was to trace the guns to cartel-related scenes. Well, your background should tell you what that means, right? That's usually the scene is a crime scene or some search warrant. So, I mean, those scenes also, the gun was found, but so was usually some dead Mexican cop or some dead Mexican civilian, sometimes a cartel guy, which I get it, is a little bit less appalling than some innocent person, but it's still, I mean, there's a lot of death happening, and that they were willing to just consider that worth the risk flies in the face of everything I think that I swore my hand and promised to do to the taxpayer.
And which part of that is considered Fast and Furious? Is that whole thing considered Fast and Furious?
Fast and Furious, it's funny, yes, I'm glad you asked that. Fast and Furious was the case that the new group, which was Phoenix, like I said, when my group's mandate changed to home invasions, they stood up a new group. Phoenix Group 7 was the actual name of the group. And they had a case that was actually called the Jacob Chambers case. And Jacob Chambers was one of several straw purchasers who was buying the guns for the cartels. He wasn't buying them for himself. He wasn't selling them to hunters or target shooters. He was buying them for murderers. So what happened was the targets of that case, which started in 2009, drove really souped up little Japanese cars like in the movies, like in the Fast and Furious movies. So the case was actually nicknamed Operation Fast and Furious because of the nature of the cars that the targets of the investigation drove.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. They got the little souped up Honda Civic with the loud muffler on it. And okay. So, I mean, that's what you're talking about. I mean, there's so often, especially I think people on the right, especially, are quick to focus on government corruption when a lot of times, like you're talking about, it sounds like maybe just stupidity, ineptitude, or maybe just a different way of thinking about things.
Right.
But it appears, from my perspective at least, that it's corruption. It's it's why somebody like you who's out there doing the hard work of catching criminals is not backed by an attorney that is prosecuting the crimes. Man, there's a lot there.
Well, look, the reality is back when it was happening, and you kind of touched on it, you had these two different factions. You had the Republicans saying that this came from Barack Obama down. This was an Obama-driven scandal.
Yeah.
That's not the case. It started in Phoenix. Now, did the Obama administration hold people accountable? No. But the Democrats then were like, well, no, this actually started under George Bush, which was also not true. So what really happened, one of the reasons I wrote the book, is the real story was never told because it became such a political scandal that no one actually looked at what was really happening in Phoenix, because that's what this started on the ground. And like I said, that's why the book, the name of it's The Deadly Path, How Operation Fast and Furious and Bad Lawyers Armed Mexican Cartels. The lawyers had a huge role in this. They were kind of co-architects of the strategy. And everybody expects, it's funny because we expect when you hear about corruption, the police are corrupt. You always expect the lawyers to operate with a higher level of integrity. That wasn't the case here, but it also was bad leadership in Phoenix on the ATF side and malfeasance. Now, malfeasance, corruption kind of go hand in hand. But yeah, this wasn't some bigger scandal sent from up on high down to the field.
Right.
It started in the field and spun out of control.
Right. It's not like Obama was there, sending AKs to the cartels. Is that kind of what you're saying? Yeah.
Right. Neither was Bush before that. I mean, this was all boots on the ground stuff happening in Phoenix.
Yeah. Well, that's what you just talked about, the fact that it got so spun out of control and politicized didn't allow people to actually see the real story. I love that because that's just what I see happening all the time, almost all the time on every issue. I mean, no matter what's happening, people get spun up on XYZ political thing, left, right, and they don't actually see the actual facts of what's happening. And that's just, man, there's a lot of lessons to be learned about there. What would be your highlight of this whole experience going through writing the book? And as you look back at it now, like what would be the highlight of what you learned?
Well, there's two things. One is leadership matters, like leadership decisions that were made during that scandal and even leading up to it. Because I tell the story about leading up to Fast and Furious, the scandal itself, and then what happened afterwards for telling the truth. And there was some good leadership. Like when I was subpoenaed, for example, the new commander of the Phoenix Field was called Special Agents in Charge, because the original cast and crew was removed. The new one, unlike what you hear in government, when I got that subpoena, he reached into his pocket, a guy named Tom Brandon. He handed me a challenge coin. He was a very, very religious man, very devout Catholic. And it was a St. Michael challenge coin. And he said, Pete, they're going to throw fastballs at you, them meeting Congress. You need to answer the question. And his promise to me was, as long as you're telling the truth, I have your back. And for the years where I was fighting to clear my reputation, he kept his word, which is not what you expect. Usually whistleblowers are kind of run out of town, right, and discarded by management. Tom was a man of honor, former Marine, believed in his oath to the Constitution, and believed as long as you're telling the truth, Pete, I have your back. And he lived up to that for many, many years. But there were things that happened before that where leaders could have pushed back against bad ideas from prosecutors, could have engaged in difficult conversations. Mm-hmm. They chose not to. And again, careers were ended because leaders didn't lead. Sure. But the reason I wrote the book was, I know you have an intelligence background. There's a lot to be learned from mistakes. And when we would talk about Fast and Furious, because again, this was a boots on the ground thing, it can happen again if people don't know what happened. And when we would talk about doing like the military does, like there's an abysmal failure here. Let's study it. Let's talk about it. Let's teach on it so it doesn't happen again. The Department of Justice, which is run by lawyers, took a different stance. They were like, shh, we don't talk about Fast and Furious. So I would have agents who were with ATF during the scandal from other parts of the country ask me, hey, what really happened there? And, over beers, I would tell them if we were out. But in ATF office space or in DOJ office space or at the ATF Academy, I wasn't allowed to talk about it. So how do you prevent it from happening again if you can't talk about it? So when I wrote the book, it was, I'm going to write a book. It's not going to have any politics in it. It's going to be exactly what I saw, no speculation, like what I saw, what I experienced, so that agents can read it and see what happened, hoping that it, again, it prevents it from happening again, but also that it tells the story without the political spin from either the Republican side or the Democrat side. Just what I saw and experienced. Again, I don't speculate on anything. I don't go into, any kind of weird theories. I think it'll still upset people to see what I actually physically saw with my own eyes. That stuff is not what the taxpayer expects of federal agencies and federal agents, but, it's just the honest truth.
It's crazy how the truth can upset people.